How do most speakers open their speeches? What are some of the first things you usually hear them say? Well, average speakers say things like, I'm so glad to be here on this wonderful occasion, or I want to thank the people who brought me in, or it's such a great day to be here. Do you know what their audiences are thinking at that point? So what? Who cares? This is going to be average at best. And these are all what I call unpleasant pleasantries. And they're definitely not the way you want to start a presentation. I like what my friend and fellow world champion Darren LaCroix says. He says, look, we don't need a weather report. Most of us were just outside. So we have to understand that within the first 30 seconds, our audience will realize whether or not they want to hear more. So the absolute first thing you say is critical. It can break the ice or it can put your audience on ice. You choose. Here's the real key to a strong first 30 seconds. Do something unexpected, but not uncalled for. What I mean is you don't want to do something that's completely bananas and just in the name of being unexpected. Instead, you just want to make sure you come out with a bang. And that means you must remove these unpleasant pleasantries. By far, the three best ways to start a speech are the following. Number 1, a story. 2, a question. And 3, a curious statement. Let's start with a story. Number 1. Sometimes I'll approach the stage, and after they finish applauding, the very first thing I say is, when I was in prison, visiting, an inmate came up after my presentation and boom, stop right there. I jump right into my story. It hooks people from the very beginning, which is why a story is the absolute best way to start. And it works because what does the audience really expect? They expect unpleasant pleasantries like every other speaker gives. So when you dive right into your story, they think, well, this should be different. Another way to open is with a powerful question. For example, listen to this 30-second live example of how I opened one of my presentations. What do you think is the number one thing that stands in the way of most people becoming great at anything? Themselves? Okay, what else? Fear. What else? Practice. Now, if I'm speaking to entrepreneurs, I might say, what do you think is the number one thing that stands between most entrepreneurs getting more customers? Either way, starting with a question immediately takes your audience from being passive spectators to being active participants. And it sets the flavor for how they'll be during the entire speech. Because they're going to think, well, I guess I'll be involved during this presentation. The other best way to begin is by making a curious statement. So listen to this one live example of how I started one of my speeches with a statement that made my audience curious. I know it sounds strange, but first of all, I want to thank you for my name tag. It might not mean much to you, but when I was in Vancouver, I don't know how big they thought I was, but they gave me a name tag that hung down here. Now, I don't care how confident of an individual you thought you were. You're going to be somewhat self-conscious if all weekend long people come up to you and say, hey, Craig, how you doing? Welcome back. Now, I should admit there is another great way to open a speech, and it's called the callback. However, you're going to pick that up in a different speaking tip because callbacks can be used all over the presentation. Oh, and one last thing. You might ask, well, Craig, I still think it's appropriate to thank the people who brought me in and maybe say a few nice words about them and about the occasion. Well, my response is great. Do it. Just don't do it within the first 30 seconds. Instead, you want to use what I call the sitcom approach. When you watch a sitcom show today, how do they normally open? Usually they begin with a funny scene that sets the premise for the show. Then, and only then, do they cut to the opening credits and the theme song, which is the equivalent of thanking the audience. In other words, they hook you in first, and then they cover those other necessities. And if you do the same, you'll come out with a bang, and you'll have your audience enthralled from the very beginning. So that's the tip for this week. Until next week, keep speaking up. Speaking